So secondary service connection is when you have a disability that wasn't present in service. It wasn't necessarily caused by service, but it was caused by a service-connected disability. Essentially, you can have a service-connected disability that down the line causes problems and leads to other medical problems. A very common example of this is service-connected PTSD over time can actually affect the way that you breathe, that you sleep, the way that you take in air, and that can over time lead to obstructive sleep apnea. Even though maybe you didn't snore or have obstructive sleep apnea in service, you can show that it was caused by your service-connected disability. So for sinusitis, let's do an example. You broke your nose in 1982 during service, so not in the Gulf War period, it's completely unrelated. And you're service connected for a deviated septum because there's records, it happened in service, you still have it. Okay. Now, years following service, still have this deviated septum, but over time you begin to develop chronic sinus infections and sinusitis. Even though you didn't have sinusitis in service, that's not why you're asking them to connect you. You would be asking them to connect you based on secondary service connection. If your deviated septum can be medically linked to problems such as problems breathing, can give you nosebleeds, and it can even cause chronic sinus infections. You need a medical nexus to link your deviated septum to sinusitis, but that should be, for a doctor to be able to say, yes, this is known in medical literature. They can explain the mechanisms, how a deviated septum can predispose you to infections, etc. That would be good enough to show, okay, this condition that I currently have was caused by my service-connected condition. Therefore, I should have secondary service connection. Final method of service connection that is probably the least commonly talked about, but just as effective for getting service connection. And once you get there, it doesn't matter how you got there. It just matters to get it service connected, right? So another method of service connection is aggravation. And so this is when you have a disability that maybe even wasn't a disability. It was just like a condition that you had before service that during service is worsened beyond the natural progression. That's the important part. During service, you have a worsening of whatever condition you came in with, and your service, whatever happened during it, caused that condition progress more quickly than it would have if you were only, say, working an office job. Then you can get service connection by aggravation. So a very common example of this is flat feet. Veteran goes into service. She's found to have flat feet in her induction exam, but doesn't really have symptoms. She's found fit for service. No problem, really. It's just noted on that exam. However, over time, with months of PT, marching, all kinds of activity in uncomfortable boots, she may begin to experience a worsening of that foot pain. So even though maybe you have flat feet to begin with, it's not causing you problems. Hours and hours and hours of marching and training are going to probably affect that condition. So even if veterans say she had flat feet going into service, coming out, she still has flat feet, but they're much more symptomatic, painful. She may have developed other conditions. If a medical opinion can show that the increased physical activity of military service caused her flat feet to progress much more quickly than it would have done if she wasn't in the military. So if she was working a sedentary job, for example, that wouldn't have happened. You're not generally marching in your office physically, mentally. Sometimes it can feel that way. So essentially, if you can show that the condition would not have been as symptomatic, she wouldn't likely have pain or these other foot problem, gait problems in this short amount of time, were it not for the service activities, then she could get service connection for flat feet, based on aggravation. Another example from a case I've worked on, a veteran had asymptomatic scoliosis going into service. He was born with it, just a slight curve, didn't affect his physical activity or ability in any way. However, during service, he was in a football game and got speared, tackled from the side, hit his torso, really hurt his back. He ended up with a recurring chronic back condition. Even though he had that scoliosis going into service, and VA initially wants to say, Now the back problems from that, he was born with that. What do you want us to do about it? We were able to get an orthopedic expert explain that this type of scoliosis would not normally become symptomatic or cause problems at this veteran's young age, if not for that in-service injury. So that's aggravating the existing scoliosis from that in-service injury, showing that it's worsened beyond the progression of the disease naturally. Secondary service connection. For chronic sinusitis, service connection based on aggravation. An example would be, say a veteran goes into service with mild allergies noted on his entrance exam. That could be allergies from childhood or just seasonal hay fever, something like that. Where it's not causing a disability, it's not causing a problem every day, it's not affecting your life really. However, when you go into service, your duty is firefighter. So that's going to mean that you are probably around smoke, smoke whether through organic materials or inorganic materials, anything like that. You're around smoke throughout service. Eventually, you develop chronic sinusitis. What we would need to show for service connection based on aggravation is that just because those mild allergies, yeah, you came into service with those, they would not develop into the point where you have chronic sinusitis if it were not for the recurring in-service smoke exposure. If you get out of service and you're constantly having these sinus infections, whereas you weren't having them before you went into service, you just had a little bit of allergies, that would be a way to show that that in-service exposure aggravated your allergies to the point where you now have this chronic recurring disabling problem.